guys, welcome to lesson 8. We are going to continue our work with decimals. Today we are going to be talking about reading and writing decimals. So we've kind of already been doing this in that we've already been working with decimals. And like I said last week, it kind of would have been nice to have this lesson maybe earlier in the series so that we could be developing a common language about how we talk about decimals, but that's not how they decided to structure the book. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and start on page 145. The problem there says, so on page 145. So the problem there says, Jessica reads aloud from a science website. She comes across the measurement 0.32. How should she read this measurement aloud? Explain how you know. So we're actually going to switch over to page 146 now to talk about this. So the first one, number 1, says explain how to read 0.32 aloud. And we've only just ever so briefly touched on this, but we know that the 3 is in the 10th place, and the 2 is in the 100th place. So the rule is that we're going to go ahead and use the farthest place value to the right for our units. So that means that we're going to be talking about hundredths. So we're going to think about out of how many hundredths we would have, right? So now if I look at this, I would have 2 hundredths, but then I have a 3 in the tenths. So what we say is we say that that would be 32 hundredths, right? Because I have 3 in the tenths, but 2 in the hundredths. Now the best way that I can think of with this is let's just go ahead and ignore the 2 for a second. I'm going to change the 2 to a 0. And so now I have a 3 in the tenths place and a 0 in the hundredths place. So for example, if I wanted to write it as a fraction for tenths, I would say that I have 3 tenths, right? Because I have a 3 in the tenths place. But if I want to talk about hundredths, then I would look at both and I would say that I have 30 hundredths. Now the way that we know that is because we know that when we are multiplying, we're getting larger, right? And so when we're dividing, we're getting smaller pieces. So 3 times 10 would give us 30, and 10 times 10 gives us 100. But we're still dividing because we still have our fractional piece. But we see that we are still dealing with our multiples of 10 because we have 3 tenths and 30 hundredths. They would actually be the same thing. And we can see that up here too with my decimals. If I erase my 0, I have 3 tenths. If I add a 0, it doesn't change the value of it. But now I would say that I have 30 hundredths. Okay? So let's go ahead. I know that might seem a little bit confusing, especially since we've only just gone over it ever so briefly previously. Let's look at number 2 where it says look ahead. So on the previous page, you used words to say the standard form of the decimal 0.32. So we said that we had, if we were to write it with our words, we would say that we have 30 to hundredths, which remember is like 100, and then we're going to add our lisp to the end, hundredths. Okay. So, and we can do that by putting it into a place value chart. But we can also use expanded form to break apart the decimal by place value. So you can use either decimals or fractions to write the expanded form of a decimal. So we kind of worked with the fractions earlier. Now let's look at some decimals. So A says complete each missing number to show 2 ways to write 0.32 in expanded form using decimals. So if I were to take this and break it into its 2 parts, I would have 3/10, right? And 2/200, right? So just like when we are expanding, let's just use the example 32. If I were to write 32 in expanded form, I would say that I have 3/10 or 30. I would add my 2 1s or 2, and that would be my expanded form. If I had the number 131, I would say I have 100 plus 3/10 or 30 plus 2 1s to make 132. Same exact principle with decimals. So we're going to take our 2 parts. We have our 3/10, our 2/100, and when we add them together, we get our 32/100, right? So the only thing that I think is tricky, not the only thing that's tricky with decimals, the trickiest thing with decimals that I think is that we're kind of reversing our place value order, right? So we think of tens as less than hundreds, and that's true. But with decimals, we're saying we have tenths are greater than hundredths, because remember, we're dealing with our teeny tiny pieces. So we kind of have to flip our brains and think of, we have 100 hundredths making up 1, or 10 hundredths making up 1/10. And then we have 10 tenths making up 1, right? So thinking back to that first lesson, we have 1 broken up into so we have our 1 broken up into itty bitty teeny tiny pieces. So our 1 unit, if I have 1 row of that, since I've divided it into 10 equal rows, 1 row would be 1/10. But then if I take just 1 of those units, because I've taken my whole and divided it into 100 little squares, 1 of those squares is going to be 100. 10 of those squares makes up 1 row, or 1/10. So they're all related, just like our place value with our whole numbers. We're just kind of reversing the order. Tenths are greater than hundredths this time. All right, let's look at B. B says complete each missing number to show 2 ways to write 0.32 or 32 hundredths in expanded form using fractions. So first we did it with decimals. I feel like for me it's a little bit easier when I'm thinking about place value with decimals to think about the fractional part, right? So like we said, we have 0.32 is the same as 3/10 plus 200. But when we're adding fractions, remember we need to have a common denominator. We need to have the same bottom number. And so that's where it comes in, where if I multiply my 3/10 by 10, I get 30 hundredths. Now if I add them, I get my 32 hundredths. Okay? So first, I would have 3/10. So on the first line, they have blanks at the top. How many tenths plus how many hundredths? And we said we have 3/10 and 2 hundredths. The second line is saying we have blank times 1/10. So remember, that would be like thinking of our unit fractions. So if I have 3/10, I have 3 1/10, right? And I would have 4 100. Okay, so if your mind is already full, if your math brain is already full, pause the video, take a little break, and then we're going to go ahead and skip pages 147 and 148 and get right on, and 149 actually as well, and get right onto page 150 to talk a little bit more about reading and writing decimals. Again, if you need a little bit of a break because your brain is already full, please feel free to pause the video and take a break because this is a lot of math terminology to take in, and I get that. Okay, so now on page 150, Josh uses a kitchen scale to weigh out some blueberries. The blueberries weigh 0.604 pounds. Josh's mom wants to know how much the blueberries weigh. How does Josh say how much the blueberries weigh? Well, again, remember that the rule is we're going to use the least place value. So I'm going to skip the first model it for a second and go right down to the second model it where it says that we have our place value chart, right? So our place value chart is saying that we have our ones place here. We have our tenths here, our hundredths here, and our thousandths here. So the rule is whatever the last place value is, whatever the number is in the last place value, that's the unit that we're going to be using. So we're going to be talking about thousandths. So now we have to think about how many thousandths, right? Now, with that, something that gets a little bit tricky, if I have a 0 as my last place value, but I have it written this way, so my number really would be 6/10, right? Because I have a 6 in the 10th place. But if I have it written like this, I could still say that I have 600 thousandths. And that's how, if I have those zeros, I'm still going to use the last place value, even if it's 0 in there. Because what may be happening is you may be comparing other decimals. So if we wanted to compare 600 thousandths to the 604 thousandths that we have, instead of having 6/10 and comparing it to 604 thousandths, we would keep it as both thousandths to be able to compare them. All right, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's go ahead and come back. The 4 is in the thousandths place, so that means that we're going to be talking about how many thousandths. So what I like to do when I think about, so now that I know that we're talking about thousandths, we're talking about some number out of 1,000, right? So what I like to do then, to think about this, is I like to just erase all of the other stuff and say, what would that number be, right? So if I took away the decimals, if I took away all the place value, if I took away everything, and I just wrote out the numbers that I have after the decimal point, that number is 604, right? And that's what I'm going to use for how many thousandths. So use the place value chart to figure out what the last place value is. That's going to be your unit. And then you're going to find how many more off of that if you just ignore all the other stuff. Look at the number. I have 604, so I would have 604 thousandths. Okay? So the decimal point is just telling you that it's going to be out of a certain number. Let's go ahead and try it with a different example. If I have 15 after my decimal point, I have tenths, and I have hundredths, right? So I know that we're going to be talking about a number out of 100. If I erase and ignore all the other stuff, I'm left with 15, which is the number that I have to the right of the decimal, right? And so I'm going to have 15 hundredths as my number. So that's kind of a quick workaround, but we're going to be still talking about all the confusing math lingo because it's important to know why we can ignore all that other stuff. So that's kind of dealing with the last modelet using a place value chart. Let's go back to the second modelet where they're using fractions. So they say with decimals, if you write it in expanded form, you have 6/10 plus 0/100, right, or nothing, plus 4, oops, no, that was right, 4,000. And so I could just ignore my hundredths and say that I'm adding 6/10 and 4,000. Okay? Or I can also think of it as 6 times 1/10 plus 4 times 1,000. Because just like with our fractions, I have 6 times 1/10 and 4 times my unit fraction of 1/1000. That would be the same thing as saying I have 6/10, I have 6 1/10, and 4 thousandths, I have 4 1,000ths. Okay? So, down below, again, I find it easier to think about it with fractions because we're already talking about tenths and thousandths and hundredths. And so if I think about it with fractions, I'm going to think I have 6/10, I have 0/100, or nothing there, right? And I have 4,000. Again, I can think of that as 6 times 1/10 and 4 times 1,000. If I were to add these, I need a common denominator. So to get to 1,000, what would I need to multiply 10 by? If I multiplied it by 10, then I would get 100. What I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. Rules of fractions still apply. So that's multiplying it by 10. Now I have 60 hundredths. If I multiply it by 10 again, I get thousands down below and 600 up top. Now I have 600 plus 4. I know that that makes 604. My bottom is comparing thousands and thousands. So I have 604 out of 1,000, or 604 thousandths. Okay, I know this is confusing. I'm trying to make it as clear as I can, but I know that it is confusing. Go ahead and turn to page 152. I'd like you to try to tackle, actually, I'm sorry, go ahead and turn to page 151. I did have questions that I wanted to answer on page 151. So number 1 says, look at the place value chart. What are the names of the 4 place values? We have ones, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. Which of those place values has the least value? So where is the last number? It's in the thousandths place, right? Number 2, look at the expanded form with fractions. How many thousandths are there altogether? There would be 604 thousandths altogether. What is the word form of 0.604? We would write it as 600 thousandths. Thousand with at the end. And what is the word form if I change it so that I have a 1 before my 600 thousandths? Then I'm going to say I have 1 and 600 thousandths because I have a whole 1 and then I have the 600,000. So I would change it to 1 and, oh, and if I was using word form, I would say 1, my 1, and you can think of the decimal point as your and, 604 thousandths. Okay, we're going to skip number 5. I'd like you to go ahead and try numbers 7, 8, and 9 on page 152 on your own. Pause the video and then resume the video to check your answers. All right, so now that you've completed numbers 7, 8, and 9 on your own, let's go ahead and look at the answers. So number 7 says, what is the word form of the number? We have 0.374. So I'm going to look to the farthest space right. That would be the 4. The 4 is in the tenths, hundredths, it's in the thousandths place. So then I'm going to ignore the rest of it and say I have 374 thousandths. Okay, 374 thousandths is how we would write that answer. It says to show your work. No, don't do that. Okay, number 8. I mean, if you can find a way to show your work, that's great. Just explaining it, but yeah, no. All right, number 8. A number is written in expanded form as, ooh, I love a good math mystery. 7 times 10 plus 5 times 1/10 plus 1 times 100 plus 6 times 1,000. Okay. So in order to properly figure this out, we're going to have to introduce something called PEMDAS, which is really going to be something you will expand on more when you get to middle school. But when you get to middle school, and if you can tell your math teacher that you know about PEMDAS, she or he is going to be really excited that you already know PEMDAS, because that is the order. It's also known as the order of operations. Operations, remember, are what we do in math: add, subtract, multiply, divide. But there's a few extra pieces to that. So PEMDAS is basically just an acronym. I'm going to write it this way, like our acrostic poems. So, and I'm going to start in the middle. M is for multiply, D for divide, A for add, and S for subtract. So if you don't even worry about the P and the E, if you have PEMDAS, you're going to multiply. If you have a long equation that has all kinds of operations in it, add, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, you're going to first tackle the multiplication problem first, then the division, then the addition, then the subtraction. Now, the only other things in here are E is for exponents, and P is for parentheses. Okay, so if you have a math problem that has parentheses, you do the stuff in the parentheses before you do anything else, even if it's adding. If you have any exponents, like we've been talking about powers to 10, you'll want to figure out the exponent before you do anything else. Then next up comes multiplying. So let's go ahead and think about PEMDAS as we're looking at this super long and involved problem, right? So I'm going to first pick out my multiplication parts, and I'm going to multiply first, I notice that my operations, I have multiplication, addition, and division. So I'm going to, or fractions. So we might just want to leave those as fractions and not divide. But I know that I'm going to multiply first before I add because that's what PEMDAS tells me to do. So I'm going to look at my 7 and 10. I'm going to look at my 5 and 1/10, my 1 and 100th, and my 6 and 1,000 as all separate pieces, and then I'm going to add them up. So I have 7 times 10 is going to be 70. I'm going to add that to 5 times 1/10, which would be like 5 tenths, right? Because I have 5 1/10ths, I have 5 tenths. I'm going to add that to 1 times 100th, or 1 100th. And I'm going to add that to 6 times 1,000, 6 times 1,000, or 6 1,000s, right? Okay, so now I'm going to erase all this other confusing stuff because I have just started on my step to make the problem easier. And that's the cool thing about math, is that there is always a way to make the problem easier. As we've been talking about with multiplying and dividing really, really big numbers, split those suckers up. Make them into smaller numbers, and that way they'll be easier because you already know a lot about multiplication and how to multiply. So if you can figure out ways to add, subtract, multiply, divide, you are going to be set. Wait, no, I'm sorry. If you can figure out ways to make the problem easier, you will be set. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and erase PEMDAS, but it's a good thing to lodge into your brain for when you go to middle school, which will be next year. Ah, crazy. Okay, so now we're left with, I have 7 tenths, or I'm sorry, not 7 tenths, 7 tenths, right, or 70. And then I switch all over to my fractions. So I'm going to go ahead and start my decimal and say that now I have 5 in the 10ths place, 1 in the 100ths place, and 6 in the 1000ths place. So now that would be the decimal form, but they're telling us to give the word form. So remember, we're going to think of the decimal as the word and. So I have 70. And now I'm going to look at my decimal, look at the farthest place value to the right. It's a 6 and it's in the thousandths place. So then I'm going to ignore the rest and say that I have 516,000. Okay. All right. Number 9, what is the word form of 807.057? All right, so we could think of we could think of a place value chart for this, right? I'm going to go ahead and take my place values. I'm going to look over here. I have thousands. Okay, and then I have 100. And then I have 10. Let's make it for 10. And I have my decimal point. Then I have ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. But we're not going that high, so I'm going to go ahead and stop at hundreds, right? Okay, so I'm actually going to start over here on the very farthest right. I'm going to say I have a 7 in the thousandths place. I have a 5 in the hundredths place, and I have 0 tenths, right? Now I'm at the decimal point, so now I have a 7 in the ones place, a 0 in the tens place, and an 8 in the hundreds place. So now that I have my place value chart, now I'm going to go ahead and write it out in word form. I have 807, right? 807 on this side of the decimal point. My decimal point is going to be like and in my word form, 807 and. Now, if I ignore everything else, I have the 7 in my thousandths place, that's the last place value. I have 0 tens, so I'm going to ignore that and say that I have 57,000. Oops, not 5B. 57,000. Okay. So 807 and 57 thousandths is how we would say this number and how we would write it in word form. Okay, turning the page, pages 153 and 154 we will be covering in our practice session on Thursday. So go ahead and keep flipping until you get to page 156. Okay, a school holds a running race. Abba finishes the race 1 16,000 seconds ahead of Nadia. Brianne finishes 2 3500 seconds ahead of Chandra. What decimals represent these measurements? Use a model to support your answer. So now we're going to be taking numbers that are written out in word form and writing them as decimals. Okay, so Abba finishes the race. Okay, 1 16,000 seconds ahead of Nadia. So I'm going to go ahead. This always seems like it happens during your guys' math lessons. Okay, so 1 16,000 of a second. So let's go ahead and start with our place value chart. Okay. So I know that the and is going to correspond with a decimal point, right? So I'm going to put my decimal here. So this would be tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and I have ones and tens just in case I need them. All right, so Ava finishes the race 1 and. So we see 1 and then she has 16 thousandths. So I would have a 6 in my thousandths. This would be 16 thousandths. So I'm going to include a 0 here because otherwise, if I had a number here like 1, that would be 116, right? I only want 16 thousandths. So I want it to end in the thousandths. So this would be how we would write 1 16 thousandths as a decimal. Now this is again using the second modelet as a place value chart. Now let's look at Brianne. Brianne finishes 2 3500 seconds before Chandra. So we don't know what their race times were, and that's really not what we're asking. We're just asking to figure out what the decimals are based on what's written. So Brianne, we see 2 and, so we know that we're going to have 2 and, decimal point, 35 hundredths. So that means that we're going to end in the hundredths. We would have 35 hundredths. So we're not going to put anything in the thousandths, right? Because if we did this, we would say that we have 350 thousandths, which would be the same. But since it said we have 35 hundredths, we're just going to write it like this. Okay. Now, for the first model, it says that you can also use fractions to come up with these numbers, with these mixed numbers, right? So if we have 1 16 thousandths, we could think of that as 1 16, 16 out of 1,000. And for Brianne, she has 2 35 hundredths. So that would be how we would write them out as our fractions. And so then we could go ahead and expand them out by saying I have 1 plus 16 out of 1,000. I'm going to keep expanding that and think of that's like saying I have 1 and that's like saying I have 1 and 10,000 plus 6,000, right? Because I've taken my 16 and broken it into 10 and 6. And then I'm going to take that 0 away on each and say that then I have 106,000. So it's like saying that I have 1 plus 106,000 to make a total of 116,000. Okay, watch it again for the second one. I'm going to break it apart. I say I have 2 plus 35 out of 100, 35 hundredths. Or that's like saying I have 2 and 30 hundredths and 5 more hundredths. If I take away a 0 from the top and the bottom, I get 2 and 3/10 and 5 hundredths. Okay? I don't know why I'm saying okay since you guys aren't here to respond, but that's just a habit of mine, I guess. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep turning. Turn to page 158. Go ahead and do problems 7, 8, and 9 on your own. Pause the video, and then come back and we'll check your answers. All right, now that you've completed numbers 7, 8, and 9 on your own, let's go ahead and double check your work. So number 7 says, what decimal represents 10 and 75 hundredths? Show your work. So you can think of it as we have 10 and, that and is going to be like a decimal, 75 hundredths, because our 5's in the hundredths place, right? So that's going to be our answer, but we still have to show our work. We still have to show how we got it. So one way that you might do is you might use fractions to show. We have 10 and, because and can be like addition, right? We're adding on to it. 10 and 75 hundredths. Or I could think of that as 10 and 70 hundredths plus 5 more hundredths, or 10 and get rid of a 0 on the top and the bottom, 7/10 and 5 hundredths. Now if we look up here and we think about our place value chart, we have 10 and 7/10 and 5 hundredths, right? Because our 7 is in the 10th spot and our 5 is in the 100th spot. We've just shown it, breaking it down into fractions. So that can be one way that you're showing your work for how you got the decimal form of 10 and 75 hundredths. All right, number 8, a number is written in expanded form as 9 times 1,000. Okay, so let's just go ahead and before I read any more, 9 times 1,000 is going to get us what? That's like 9 1,000s. That's like saying we have 9, whoops, 1,000. Okay, now I'm going to add on to it 6 times 1, or 6 ones. So that would be like saying now I have plus 6, right? Plus I have 3 times 1/10. Now I'm putting them in parentheses just to remind myself that I'm going to multiply first. So 3 times 1/10. So that's like saying I have 3/10, right? Plus 8 times 1,000. Or 8 1,000, right? So now if I'm going to add these up, I would have 9,006 We would write 9,006 like this. And now I'm getting into my fractions. 3 in the tenths place and 8 in the thousandths place, which means that I need a 0 in between in the hundredths place because I don't have any hundredths, right? So this is how we would write it out as a decimal. Let's also think about it. Oh, darn it. 9,000 plus 6 plus 3/10 plus 8,000. So you could also think of it with your place value chart, right? I have thousandths, hundredths, tenths, decimal point, ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. So I have a 9 in my thousands place. I don't have any hundreds. I don't have any tens. I have 6 ones. I have 3 in my tenths place. I don't have any hundredths. And I have 8 in my thousandths place. Either way, we're going to get the same answer of 9,006 and 308 thousandths. All right, last one, number 9. Okay, which decimal represents 6 and 54 thousandths? So they're saying we have 6 and 54 thousandths. I'm going to think of that as 6. My and is going to be like my decimal point, but I'm not quite ready to go there yet. 54 thousandths. Okay, so 6 and 54 thousandths. Or I could write it as 6 and I'm going to have 54 thousandths. So that means my 4 is going to be in my thousandths place. My 5 is going to be in my hundreds place, but then I need a filler for my tenths place. So I would have 64, or I'm sorry, I would have 6 and 54 thousandths written as a decimal because I need my last place value to be in the thousandths place because that's what we're talking about. Again, if I had 154 thousandths, then I would have a 1 in the tenths place. But I don't have any, I have only, if I think about it as, right, so I'm talking about thousandths, so I would have a 4 in the thousandths place, a 5 in the hundredths place, nothing in the tens place, right? Because I have 1 out of 1,000. So 54 out of 1,000, if I were to line that up by place value, I'm going to have like 1 and tens, hundredths, thousandths. 4 would go in the thousandths place, 5 in the hundredths place, and a 0 in the tenths place. Okay. Boy, decimals are hard work. Then if you turn to the next pages rather, 159 and 160 are going to be for our practice page session also on Thursday. And then if you keep going, pages 161 through 164, you are welcome to do for some extra practice. What I would encourage, because I know that this math lesson covered a lot, and it can get really easy to get bogged down in all of the hundredths and the tenths and the thousandths. What I would recommend doing, take the video in little chunks. When you feel your math brain get full, go do something else. Not for a whole lot of time, not go and like be done for the day, but go take a break and come back. So when you feel your math brain get full, and you all know when that point is, go get a drink of water, go get a snack, go outside for a little bit, do something active if you can is the best, or draw or color for 5 minutes, but make sure it's not a super long break. It should just be a couple minutes, clear your brain, and then come back to the video. So you can just pause it, take a little break, and then come back. And then you can do that again as you feel your brain get full. What I would also recommend doing is going and looking at some of those extra practice questions. See if you can figure out some of them to reinforce the messages that we talked about in this lesson. So I know that I threw a whole bunch of math lingo at you, including PEMDAS, which is not included in the book, but is a good thing for your math knowledge. But again, make sure to pace yourself with your math. Take little breaks as you need to. Come back, but make sure to also come back. So don't just check out for the rest of the day and be like, no, my math brain's full. Bye-bye, math. Come back to it as well so that you can keep going through the material and make sure that you finish it up. Okay, I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.